Today, I want to share a deeply unsettling true story that happened on the last day of school many years ago. It's a day that should have been filled with celebration and excitement, but instead turned into a nightmare that forever changed my perspective on safety and trust. Some details might be slightly blurry with time, but the core of this terrifying experience remains seared into my memory. I was in fourth grade, and in our elementary school system, fourth grade was the final year where kids had to be picked up by their parents. Fifth graders were granted the privilege of walking home independently. That particular day was our last day before summer break, and I had plans with my friend Dennis to have a play date afterward to celebrate. Dennis and I had been friends since kindergarten, though we weren't in the same class that year. After the final bell, we lined up as usual and walked to our designated exit doors at the end of the hallway. I waited outside with my teacher, Miss Blue, scanning the crowd of parents for Dennis's dad, who was supposed to pick us both up. That's when I heard someone calling my name. "Tommy! Tommy!" I looked over and saw a man waving enthusiastically as he approached. He introduced himself as Dennis's uncle and explained he was there to pick me up. Nothing immediately triggered alarm bells in my young mind. I walked over to Miss Blue and told her I was being picked up. She asked where the person was, and I pointed to Dennis's uncle, who waved at her from a distance. Without further verification, Miss Blue dismissed me, and I went with the man. He led me through the crowd with surprising urgency, speaking in a quick, jittery manner with a slight stutter. He walked incredibly fast, almost too fast for me to keep up with my backpack weighing me down. As we walked, he explained that Dennis's dad was working later than expected, so he was driving me instead. We reached his car, a dark red hatchback, and I climbed into the back seat. It was only at this point that my brain began processing the obvious question: where was Dennis? Why weren't we picking him up too? As if reading my confusion, the man turned to look at me from the driver's seat and said, Dennis was already at his house. Though I was confused, I was also shy around unfamiliar adults, and not one to openly question them. The entire drive, this man kept talking incessantly, telling stories about his elementary school days, asking about my classes and what sports I played. If I had to guess, we drove for about 10 minutes, which felt exceptionally long for our small town, where houses were typically within walking distance of each other. My house was just a 5-minute walk from school, yet we were clearly heading to an area I didn't recognize. When he finally parked in front of a house, nothing about it seemed immediately suspicious. It looked like a normal suburban home. He led me inside, shut the door, and, this detail stands out vividly, locked it behind us. The interior was unnervingly dark. All the curtains were drawn, making it feel like nighttime despite being mid-afternoon. The only illumination came from a dim lamp in the corner of the living room. He looked at me with a smile that no longer seemed friendly. I asked where Dennis was, and his demeanor immediately changed. He became noticeably more nervous and jittery, claiming Dennis was downstairs playing video games. He told me to wait while he checked, then disappeared through a nearby door. I heard it open and footsteps descending into what must have been a basement. My heart was racing. Deep down, I knew I was in danger. I quietly tried the front door, but it had a lock that required a key. Panic fully set in. Part of me still clung to the absurd hope that Dennis might actually be downstairs, but I knew the chances were virtually non-existent. I regretted entering that house more than anything. In that moment of clarity and fear, I did the only thing I could think of. I went to the kitchen and found a wall-mounted phone. With shaking hands, I dialed 911. When the operator answered, I whispered, "Please come to this house. I've been kidnapped." They acknowledged me, but I didn't say another word. I hid the phone under a kitchen towel in the corner with the line still open and hurried back to where the man had left me. I could already hear his footsteps returning from the basement. He called my name, saying, "Come down, Dennis is down here." When I didn't respond, he came fully up the stairs and looked at me with an expression I'll never forget. He asked if I was okay, and I felt physically sick with fear. I hated myself for walking into this situation, for not being wiser. With a trembling voice, I asked if I could leave. That's when his facade completely disappeared. His friendly smile vanished as he realized I was no longer falling for his deception. He approached me slowly, maintaining a gentle demeanor until he was close enough to grab my wrist. Then he seized it aggressively and began pulling me toward the basement stairs. I screamed and struggled while he shouted, "I'll let you go if you stop and behave." Terrified of what might happen if I continued fighting, I complied. He dragged me down the stairs, and halfway down, the door slammed shut behind us. I heard the distinct sound of a lock clicking. The basement was exactly what you'd imagine in your worst nightmares: an unfinished concrete floor, bare walls, and a single support beam in the center. The only light came from one exposed bulb hanging from the ceiling, casting everything in a sickly yellow glow. If there was ever a place where kidnapped children disappeared forever, this was it. I could hear his heavy footsteps pacing overhead. Every sound was amplified in that house. After what felt like an eternity, he opened the basement door and called down asking if I was hungry. I replied no, afraid he might discover the phone I'd left off the hook in the kitchen. He closed and locked the door again, leaving me alone with my terror. Then, like a miracle, I heard it, the doorbell ringing 3 times, followed by loud banging. The police had arrived. I resisted screaming immediately, waiting to hear the front door open, but the man's footsteps never approached the door. The doorbell continued ringing, and the banging grew more insistent until there was one tremendous crash. Multiple footsteps thundered through the house, accompanied by shouting voices. That's when I started screaming for help at the top of my lungs, banging frantically on the basement door. The door was unlocked from the outside, and a police officer grabbed me, quickly escorting me out of the house. At least 3 police cars were parked outside. I had to recount everything to 2 officers while we waited for my parents. The man was brought out in handcuffs and placed in a police car. That was the last time I ever saw him. When my parents arrived, my mother was inconsolable. There had already been chaos at the school as police were called, and Dennis's dad realized what had happened. We later learned this man was a work associate of Dennis's father, who had somehow discovered that Dennis's dad would be picking up both Dennis and me on the last day of school. He seized that opportunity to carry out his sick plan. To this day, I don't know how he identified me or what specifically he had planned. As I got older, I never asked for more details. I try not to think about it. My mother took me to counseling for months afterward. If I hadn't thought to call the police before he threw me in that basement, I know with absolute certainty I wouldn't be alive today. This happened about 17 years ago. For all I know, that man might be out of prison by now. The experience completely changed how I view safety, trust, and the last day of school. Miss Blue faced serious consequences for not properly verifying the identity of the person picking me up. The school implemented strict new protocols for student dismissal afterward. I share this story not to frighten people unnecessarily, but as a reminder that even in seemingly safe environments like schools, vigilance is critical. Children should be taught to question unusual situations, and schools must rigorously enforce security protocols. One lapse in verification nearly cost me my life on what should have been a joyful last day of school. The horror of that day stays with me, but I've learned to live with it. Sometimes I wonder what happened to Dennis, if he ever knew how close his friend came to disappearing forever because someone used his name as bait. I hope telling this story might save someone else from experiencing anything similar. Trust your instincts, verify identities, and remember that sometimes the most important lessons don't come from the classroom, but from the moments that test our very survival. Nothing could have prepared the students and staff of Westlake High School for what would unfold on what should have been a day of celebration and relief. June 9th, 2022, the last day of school, a date that will forever be etched into the memory of this small suburban community, not for the excitement of summer's arrival, but for the unimaginable horror that transformed their lives in the span of just a few hours. The morning began like any typical last day of school. Students arrived with empty backpacks, yearbooks clutched in their hands, and an infectious energy that only comes with the promise of 3 months of freedom. Teachers had planned movie screenings, yearbook signings, and small parties to mark the occasion. The hallways buzzed with laughter and chatter about summer plans. Photos were snapped, hugs were exchanged, and tearful goodbyes were shared between graduating seniors and their favorite teachers. But beneath this veneer of normalcy and celebration, something sinister was brewing. What makes this story particularly disturbing is how many warning signs were either missed or dismissed in the days and weeks leading up to that fateful Thursday. According to police reports that would later be released, 17-year-old Marcus Winters, a junior who had largely kept to himself throughout high school, had been meticulously planning what investigators would later call the Last Day Massacre. Marcus wasn't particularly popular, but he wasn't heavily bullied either. He existed in that nebulous middle ground, recognized by face but rarely by name. His teachers described him as quiet but intelligent, introspective, and sometimes withdrawn. Nothing that would raise immediate red flags in an educational system already stretched thin and unable to provide adequate mental health resources to its student body. However, a deeper investigation revealed a troubling digital footprint. In the 3 months leading up to the last day of school, Marcus had been actively participating in online forums frequented by individuals with extreme ideologies. His search history showed extensive research on previous school tragedies, methods of creating improvised explosive devices, and detailed studies of his school's layout and security protocols. He had even created detailed diagrams of the school's ventilation system, emergency exits, and camera blind spots. What's perhaps most chilling is that Marcus had actually reached out for help, albeit in ways that were easy to overlook. His English teacher later revealed that his final essay for the semester, titled The Invisible Student, contained disturbing passages about feeling disconnected from reality and harboring violent thoughts. The essay had earned him an A for its technical proficiency and creative approach, but the concerning content was dismissed as creative expression rather than a potential cry for help. His school counselor, Ms. Ramirez, had met with him twice in the final month of school after he was referred by his history teacher for drawing disturbing imagery in his notebook. But with a caseload of over 350 students and limited time, these sessions were brief and ultimately inconclusive. Marcus was skilled at presenting a composed facade when needed, and Ms. Ramirez, despite her best intentions, didn't have the time or resources to dig deeper. The night before the last day of school, Marcus made a single post on an anonymous messaging board. "Tomorrow, they'll finally see me. Tomorrow, I become unforgettable." This post would only be discovered days later when digital forensic experts combed through his online activities. When Marcus arrived at school that Thursday morning, he carried with him a large duffel bag that he claimed contained his gym clothes and yearbooks from previous years to be signed. The school's security guard, Mr. Peterson, who normally might have checked such a large bag, was distracted by the festive atmosphere and the increased number of parents dropping off treats and gifts for teachers. Marcus walked through the front doors at 7:42 a.m., approximately 18 minutes before the first bell. What we know from security footage is that Marcus went directly to the second-floor boys' bathroom near the science labs, an area that would be largely empty during the morning's extended homeroom period. It was there that he unpacked his bag, which contained not yearbooks or gym clothes, but 3 improvised explosive devices constructed using information he'd gathered online, a hunting knife that belonged to his father, and several bottles of a homemade chemical compound that would later be identified as a crude but effective form of chlorine gas. The first indication that something was wrong came at 8:27 a.m. when the fire alarm was triggered. This was no accident. Marcus had deliberately set off the alarm to implement the first phase of his plan. As students and staff began evacuating according to standard fire drill procedures, Marcus positioned his first explosive device in the ventilation shaft of the east stairwell, a route designated as a primary evacuation path for 6 classrooms. The device detonated at 8:31 a.m., causing not a massive explosion, but rather releasing the chlorine gas mixture into the ventilation system. The effects were almost immediate. Students and teachers evacuating down the east stairwell began experiencing burning sensations in their eyes and throats, difficulty breathing, and disorientation. Panic ensued as people rushed to exit the increasingly toxic environment, creating a dangerous bottleneck at the stairwell's exit. School Resource Officer James Wilson, hearing the commotion and receiving reports of students collapsing, immediately called for emergency services and began implementing lockdown protocols for students who hadn't yet evacuated. This quick thinking likely saved dozens of lives, as it prevented more students from entering the contaminated areas. As chaos unfolded in the East Wing, Marcus moved to the library, which, according to the school's emergency procedures, was a designated shelter-in-place location during certain types of emergencies. There, approximately 42 students and 3 staff members had followed protocol and were barricading the doors, unaware that the threat was already inside with them. What happened in the library over the next 27 minutes is pieced together from survivor accounts and partial security footage. Marcus initially blended in with the frightened students, even helping to move bookshelves against the doors. It wasn't until the school librarian, Mrs. Patel, began taking attendance to report to emergency services that Marcus revealed his intentions. According to survivor testimonies, Marcus stood up calmly and said, "This is where I become visible. This is where I become important." He then produced his second explosive device, this one designed not for chemical dispersal, but for maximum concussive impact. In what can only be described as an act of extraordinary courage, 16-year-old Sophie Chen, a sophomore who had taken a community emergency response training course the previous summer, recognized the threat immediately. While others froze in shock or began to panic, Sophie lunged at Marcus, tackling him to the ground before he could activate the detonator. The impact caused Marcus to drop the device, which skidded across the floor. In the ensuing struggle, Marcus stabbed Sophie twice with his hunting knife, once in the shoulder and once in the abdomen, but she maintained her hold on him, screaming for others to help. 2 senior football players, Trevor Washington and Daniel Okafor, along with history teacher Mr. Gonzalez, rushed to her aid, subduing Marcus until law enforcement could arrive. The third explosive device, which was discovered later in Marcus's locker, had been set with a timer to detonate at 9:15 a.m. in the school cafeteria, where many students would have gathered after the all-clear from what they believed was a routine fire alarm. Had this device detonated as planned, casualties would have been catastrophic. The final toll of that day was mercifully lower than it could have been, but still devastating for the tight-knit community. One student, Sophie Chen, succumbed to her injuries 2 days later in the hospital. 14 students and 2 teachers required hospitalization for chemical exposure, with 3 suffering permanent respiratory damage. The psychological toll, however, extends far beyond these numbers. In the aftermath, the inevitable questions arose: how was this allowed to happen? Who missed the warning signs? What could have been done differently? The investigation revealed a cascade of institutional failures, communication breakdowns, and resource limitations that created perfect conditions for this tragedy. Marcus's parents, devastated and bewildered, claimed they had no knowledge of their son's plans. A search of their home revealed that Marcus had maintained a hidden space in their basement where he'd conducted his research and constructed his devices. His father's hunting knife had been reported missing 3 weeks earlier, but they assumed it had been misplaced during a recent camping trip. Marcus's online activities had largely gone unmonitored. His parents, like many, respected his privacy and were unaware of the dark corners of the internet he was exploring. His school-issued laptop had filtering software, but Marcus had been using a prepaid phone purchased with cash to conduct his most disturbing research. Perhaps most tragically, Marcus's journal, found in his bedroom, revealed a troubled mind desperate for connection. Entries dating back months detailed feelings of invisibility, insignificance, and a growing resentment toward his peers who seemed to navigate social situations with an ease he could never grasp. The final entry, written the night before, simply read, "Tomorrow, everyone will know my name. Tomorrow, I'll finally matter." Today, I want to share some truly disturbing stories that happened on the last day of school. These accounts come from real people who experienced terrifying situations during what should have been a day of celebration and relief. The details of these stories will make you question how safe we really are even in seemingly secure environments like schools. Let's dive into these bone-chilling experiences. Our first story takes place during the narrator's elementary school years. It was the last day of fourth grade, a significant milestone as it marked the final year where students had to be picked up by their parents. Fifth graders were granted the privilege of walking home on their own, so this was a transitional period for many students. On this particular day, the narrator had plans to celebrate the end of the school year with his friend Dennis. They'd been friends since kindergarten, though they weren't in the same class that year. The plan was simple. Dennis's dad would pick them both up, and they would have a play date to mark the occasion. As school ended, the students lined up single file and walked to the exit door at the end of the hallway. Their teacher, Miss Blue, waited with them outside as parents arrived to collect their children. The narrator was scanning the crowd, looking for Dennis's dad among the parents shuffling in and out of the parking lot. Suddenly, he heard someone calling his name. "Tommy! Tommy!" When he looked over, he saw a man waving and approaching him. The man introduced himself as Dennis's uncle and said he was there to pick him up. Without much thought, Tommy went to Miss Blue and informed her he was being picked up. When she asked where the person was, Tommy pointed to Dennis's uncle, who waved at the teacher. Miss Blue dismissed Tommy, and he left with the man. This is where things started to feel off. The man led Tommy through the crowd quickly, speaking in a fast, jittery manner with a slight stutter. He was walking so fast that Tommy could barely keep up while carrying his backpack. The man explained that Dennis's dad was working later than expected, so he was driving Tommy instead. They reached a dark red hatchback, and it was only then that Tommy realized something crucial was missing. Dennis. Where was his friend? Why weren't they picking him up too? When Tommy got into the back seat, the man turned to him and said that Dennis was already at his house. This explanation didn't make sense to Tommy, but being shy around adults and not one to speak his mind when confused, he remained quiet. The entire drive lasted about 10 minutes, which seemed unusually long considering Tommy's house was only a 5-minute walk from school. They were definitely in an unfamiliar area when the man finally parked in front of a house. The house looked normal from the outside, but once they entered, the man locked the door behind them. The interior was extremely dark, with all the curtains drawn and only a dim lamp in one corner providing light. When Tommy asked about Dennis again, the man became noticeably nervous and jittery. He claimed Dennis was downstairs playing video games and said he would check on him. The man disappeared into a nearby room, and Tommy heard a door open followed by footsteps descending into a basement. At this point, Tommy's heart was racing. He knew he was in danger. He tried to quietly open the front door to escape, but discovered it required a key to unlock. Panic was setting in, but he still held a sliver of hope that Dennis might actually be in the basement, though he knew it was unlikely. Realizing the severity of his situation, Tommy went to the kitchen and found a wall-mounted phone. He dialed 911 and whispered, "Please come to this house. I've been kidnapped." The dispatcher acknowledged him, but Tommy didn't say anything more. He hid the phone under a towel in the corner of the room, leaving the line open, and hurried back to where the man had left him. He could already hear footsteps coming back upstairs. The man called Tommy's name, saying, "Come down, Dennis is down here." When Tommy didn't respond, the man came fully up the stairs and asked if he was okay. Tommy, feeling sick with fear and regretting his decision to go with this stranger, asked in a scared voice if he could leave. The man's demeanor changed instantly. His fake friendly smile disappeared as he realized Tommy was no longer falling for his ruse. He approached Tommy gently until he was close enough to grab his wrist aggressively, then started pulling him toward the basement. Tommy screamed and cried, but the man shouted, "I'll let you go if you stop and behave." Tommy complied out of fear and went down the stairs. Halfway down, the door slammed shut behind him, and he heard it lock. The basement was empty and unfinished, with a concrete floor and a single support beam in the middle. A depressing yellow glow came from one exposed light bulb hanging from the ceiling. A scene straight out of a nightmare, exactly what you'd imagine a place where kidnapped children are taken would look like. Tommy could hear the man's heavy footsteps moving around upstairs. After some time, the man opened the basement door and asked if Tommy was hungry. Tommy said no, not wanting the man to go into the kitchen and discover the missing phone. The door was shut and locked again. Then came the moment of salvation. The doorbell rang 3 times, followed by banging sounds, clearly police officers at the door. Tommy refrained from screaming until he heard the front door open, but that didn't happen immediately. The doorbell continued ringing and the banging persisted until there was a very loud bang, followed by multiple heavy footsteps and voices shouting. At this point, Tommy started screaming for help as loudly as he could, banging on the door at the top of the stairs. The door was unlocked, and a police officer grabbed him and quickly escorted him outside. There were at least 3 police cars, and Tommy had to recount everything to 2 officers while they waited for his parents to arrive. The kidnapper was brought outside in handcuffs and put into a police car, the last time Tommy ever saw him. When his parents arrived, his mother was sobbing uncontrollably. There had been chaos at the school when the police were called, and Dennis's dad realized what had happened. The kidnapper turned out to be a work associate of Dennis's father, who had somehow learned that Dennis's dad would be picking up both boys from school on the last day. He seized this opportunity to carry out his sick plan. Tommy never learned how the man knew what he looked like, or more details about the incident, as he tried not to think about it afterward. His mother took him to counseling for months following the traumatic experience. The most disturbing part? Tommy reflects that if he hadn't thought to call the police before being thrown into that basement, he would almost certainly be dead. The incident happened about 17 years ago, meaning the kidnapper might even be out of prison now. Our second story takes place during the narrator's junior year of high school, also on the last day of school. Many students either skipped school entirely or left after lunch period on this day, and the narrator and their friends were among those who left early. It was a stormy, dark day which had caused the cancellation of original plans to go to the beach. Instead, the friend group decided to explore an abandoned elementary school in town that hadn't been used for about 10 years and was scheduled for demolition by the end of the year. They reasoned that with no cameras in the old building and the stormy weather keeping people indoors, no one would notice them breaking in. After lunch period, their friend Eddie, who had a car and license, drove them to the abandoned school. The building was situated in a residential neighborhood, away from main roads. There was a back parking lot obscured by overgrown bushes and trees on one side, and the school walls on the other sides, a perfect spot to park unnoticed. The place wasn't boarded up, just locked. Eddie had a baseball bat in his trunk, which he used to smash one of the school's windows. The narrator was nervous that despite the pouring rain, someone in one of the nearby houses might hear the noise. After breaking the window, Eddie cleared the remaining glass with the bat, and they all climbed through. They entered what appeared to be a 4th or 5th grade classroom, based on the decorations still on the walls. It was surreal to be inside what was once an active learning space for children, now cold, dark, and abandoned, collecting dust while awaiting destruction. The thunder and lightning outside added to the eerie atmosphere. There were no lights on in the building. The power had likely been cut entirely. They had anticipated this and used their phone flashlights to navigate. Even without them, it wasn't completely dark, as some daylight still filtered through the windows despite the stormy weather. As they explored the hallways and various classrooms, still filled with desks and chairs untouched for a decade, they heard a sound echoing down the hallway. They all went silent and turned off their lights momentarily. After a flash of lightning, they convinced themselves it was nothing and continued their exploration. But as they approached a corner in the hallway, the narrator looked back and noticed something sticking out from one of the classroom doorways. When all 4 friends pointed their phone flashlights in that direction, whatever they had seen retracted into the classroom. Alarmed, they ran down an intersecting hallway until they were far enough away, finding themselves in what appeared to be the kindergarten wing. Then they heard another sound echo from down the hallway, confirming they weren't alone. Worried about getting in trouble, they ducked into the nearest classroom and shut